The gavel came down like a gunshot, and Irene Underwood felt the sound of it rattle through every bone in her body. She stood on the raised wooden platform in the center of Caldwell, Kansas, in the brutal August heat of 1878, her wrists bound together with rough hemp rope that had already rubbed the skin raw. Around her, perhaps 200 men pressed shoulder to shoulder in the dusty main square, their faces flushed with excitement or whiskey or both, their eyes moving over her the way men's eyes move over livestock they intend to purchase. She kept her chin up. She had promised herself that much, at least. Whatever happened today, whatever humiliation was visited upon her by the man who had arranged this grotesque spectacle, she would not let them see her break. She would not give Harlan Moss that satisfaction. Harlan Moss, who had murdered her father for his land deed. Harlan Moss, who had forged documents naming himself the sole executor of the Underwood estate. Harlan Moss, who had standing now at the base of the platform with a cigar between his teeth and the smile of a man who believed himself completely untouchable, watching as the auctioneer, his bought and paid for man named Dexter Cray, announced to the assembled crowd that one Irene Underwood, age 22, formerly of the Underwood homestead some 14 miles east of Caldwell, was being offered as an indentured worker to settle outstanding debts allegedly owed by her late father's estate. It was a lie wrapped inside a legal document that nobody had examined closely enough, and it was about to destroy her. "Starting bid is $50, Dexter Cray called out, his nasal voice cutting across the square. "The young lady is in good health, capable of domestic work, and the contract runs for 5 years. Who will open?" Hands went up. Irene's stomach turned to ice. She scanned the crowd with the controlled desperation of a woman searching for any face she recognized, any face that carried anything other than hunger or amusement or the blank assessment of a man calculating the value of a purchase. $50 became 70, 70 became 90. She heard the voices, but the words blurred together into a single horrible sound, and then she saw him. He was standing at the far edge of the crowd, slightly apart from the press of bodies, and the first thing she noticed was that he was completely still. Everyone else was moving, shifting, calling out numbers, craning to see the bidding board. This man was simply standing there with his arms crossed over his chest and his dark eyes fixed not on her but on Harlan Moss. He was tall and lean in a way that suggested hard work rather than lack of nourishment, wearing a dark coat that had seen considerable trail dust and a hat pulled low against the sun. There was a quality about him that she could only describe, even in that moment of her own terror, as the quality of absolute authority. Not the loud, chest-thumping authority of men like Harlan Moss, something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. Someone beside him leaned over and said something, gesturing toward the platform with a nod that clearly indicated she was the subject. The tall man looked at her then, just briefly. His eyes met hers across the entire distance of that crowded square, and she felt something pass between them that she could not name, something that had nothing to do with the auction or the rope around her wrists or the horror of her situation, something that existed in an entirely different register. Then Dexter Cray called out, $110, do I hear 120? And the tall man looked away from her, back toward Harlan Moss, and he uncrossed his arms and walked away from the auction entirely. He did not bid. Irene watched him go and felt something cold and devastating settle into her chest that she absolutely could not afford to examine right now, because the bidding was continuing and her life was being decided by strangers, and she needed to think. But she could not stop thinking about him. His name was Frederick Turner, and everyone in Caldwell knew it, though Irene Underwood had never had occasion to hear it before today. She would learn that later. She would learn a great many things later. But in that moment, standing on the auction platform with the sun beating down on her, and Harlan Moss looking up at her with that horrible proprietary satisfaction, all she knew was that the fiercest man at the auction had looked at her once and refused to bid, and she could not decide whether that made him the one good man in the crowd or simply the cruelest of them all. She did not yet know that his refusal was the most deliberate act of protection she would ever receive. She did not yet know that Frederick Turner had spent the last 3 years building the legal case that would unravel everything Harlan Moss had constructed. She did not yet know that the moment his eyes met hers across that crowd, something shifted permanently inside him, something that had been locked and bolted for a very long time. She did not yet know any of it, but the story of how she came to know it, and what it cost them both, and what it built between them in the dust and heat of the Kansas frontier in the summer and fall of 1878, is the only story worth telling. It begins, as most stories of consequence do, not with the moment of crisis but with everything that came before it. Irene Underwood had grown up on the homestead east of Caldwell with her father, Joseph Underwood, a quiet and methodical man who had filed his land claim under the Homestead Act of 1862 and had spent 16 years improving it from raw prairie into a working farm of genuine value. Her mother, Clara, had died of fever when Irene was 11, and after that it had been just the two of them, father and daughter, building something together in the long Kansas days. Irene had learned to read survey maps at the same table where she learned to bake bread. She knew the boundaries of their 160 acres better than she knew her own face in the mirror. She knew which creek ran along the southern edge and which cottonwood grove marked the northeast corner, and she knew that the land was worth something real now, in 1878, because the railroad had come through and changed everything about what Kansas land was worth. Harlan Moss had known it too. Moss was the kind of man who arrived in frontier towns wearing the costume of respectability, a good suit, a legal education obtained somewhere back east that he referenced constantly, an office on the main street of Caldwell with his name painted on the window in gold letters. He was perhaps 45, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was a form of power. He had made himself indispensable to the town's commercial life in ways that were difficult to untangle, serving simultaneously as a land agent, a moneylender, and an informal advisor to the county judge, whose fondness for Moss's private whiskey supply was well documented among those who paid attention. Joseph Underwood had not paid enough attention. He had taken a loan from Moss's land office in the spring of 1877, a modest sum to repair the barn roof after a brutal winter storm. The terms had seemed straightforward. Joseph had signed where Moss indicated without reading the full document, which was a common enough mistake for a man of his practical rather than legal education. What Joseph had not realized, what he could not have realized without a lawyer of his own to review the paperwork, was that Moss had embedded within the loan agreement a clause granting himself right of first refusal on the entire Underwood property in the event of default, and a secondary clause that defined the conditions of default so broadly that Moss could trigger it at any time he chose. Joseph Underwood had died in February of 1878, a death officially recorded as a fall from a horse on a cold night, though Irene had known her father to ride in worse conditions for 20 years without incident. She had tried to raise the question with the county sheriff, a man named Dobbins who had declined to investigate with a speed that told her everything she needed to know about his relationship with Harlan Moss. By April, Moss had moved to execute the fraudulent debt claim, and by July, armed with documents that the county judge, the same judge who favored Moss's whiskey, had authenticated without meaningful scrutiny, Moss had obtained a legal order declaring Irene Underwood indentured to work off the supposed debt owed by her father's estate. It was a trap built with legal language, and it had worked perfectly, and Irene had found herself on that platform in August unable to prove in the moment what she knew absolutely to be true, that every document Moss was relying on was either forged or fraudulently obtained. She had tried to find help. She had ridden to Caldwell twice before the auction date, trying to find a lawyer willing to take her case. The first had taken one look at Harlan Moss's name on the documents and declined. The second had listened sympathetically for 20 minutes and then told her that without the original loan agreement which Moss held, she had no legal standing to challenge the proceeding in time. What she had not known, what no one had told her, was that there was a third option. Frederick Turner had come to Caldwell 18 months before the auction, and he had come there because of Harlan Moss. Turner was 31 years old in the summer of 1878, a man from Virginia originally, the son of a former Confederate officer who had come west after the war with nothing but pride and debt, and a determination to rebuild in a new landscape. Frederick had grown up straddling two worlds, the remnants of a Southern gentility that had been stripped of its material basis, and the raw pragmatic necessity of frontier life. He had studied law for 2 years at a college in Missouri before the money ran out, which left him with enough legal education to be dangerous and enough frontier experience to be practical. He had come to Caldwell specifically because a man named William Hartley, a small rancher in the county, had written to him. Turner had done some legal work for Hartley 2 years prior in Dodge City, untangling a fraudulent water rights claim. Hartley's letter described Harlan Moss in careful, frightened detail, described the pattern of predatory lending and fraudulent documentation that had already swallowed 3 homesteads in the county, and asked Turner if he was in a position to look into it. Turner had been in exactly that position. He had come to Caldwell quietly, established himself as a working cowhand at one of the smaller ranches outside of town to avoid drawing Moss's attention, and had spent 18 months patiently and methodically gathering evidence. He had tracked down former victims of Moss's schemes in 3 different counties. He had located a clerk in the land office who had seen Moss alter documents and who was, with considerable effort, willing to make a statement. He had identified the relationship between Moss and the county judge and had been quietly corresponding with the United States Marshal's office in Wichita, building a federal case that would not depend on the compromised local judiciary. He was, as of August 1878, approximately 6 weeks from having everything he needed to bring Moss down entirely. The auction was not something he had anticipated. When he had ridden into Caldwell that morning and seen the notices posted on the walls of the general store and the saloon, seen Irene Underwood's name on a document that made his hands tighten with barely controlled fury, he had understood immediately that Moss was accelerating his timeline for reasons Turner could not yet fully explain. The auction was a provocation, a display of power, a message sent to anyone in the county who might be considering resistance. Look what I can do. Look what the law allows me to do. Who will stop me? Turner had stood at the edge of that crowd and done the most difficult thing he had ever done. He had watched, and he had not bid, and he had walked away. Because if he had bid, if he had purchased the indenture contract even with the intention of freeing her immediately, he would have legitimized the entire fraudulent proceeding. He would have put his own name on Moss's corrupt paperwork. He would have handed Moss's lawyers exactly the argument they needed to claim the transaction was valid and complete, which would have buried any subsequent legal challenge under layers of commercially executed documentation. The only way to save Irene Underwood was to destroy the foundation of the auction itself. But to do that in 6 weeks was going to require her cooperation. And first, he had to find her. The man who had ultimately purchased the indenture contract at the auction was a farmer named Clement Buford, a genuinely decent if somewhat oblivious man who had wanted domestic help for his wife and had not fully appreciated the nature of what he was participating in. Turner knew Buford slightly, knew him to be a man of reasonable conscience, and he rode to the Buford farm on the morning after the auction with a plan already forming. Irene had spent the night on a pallet in the Buford kitchen, sleepless, watching the ceiling and turning over possibilities with the systematic determination of a woman who refused to surrender. She had examined every legal angle she could access from memory. She had thought about what documents might still exist that could challenge Moss's claim. She had thought about her father's original land claim filing, which would be on record in the county land office, and about the original homestead patent, which she believed was still in the box beneath her father's desk. Except that Moss had taken possession of the homestead property, and she could not access it. She was sitting at the Buford kitchen table drinking coffee that Mrs. Buford had offered with genuine kindness when she heard the knock at the door. Clement Buford went to answer it and came back with the tall man from the auction behind him. Up close, Frederick Turner was even more striking than he had appeared across the distance of the crowded square. He was not handsome in the conventional, easy way of the men Irene had occasionally encountered at church socials or the county fair. His face had been shaped by weather and trouble, and something that she might have called grief if she had known him better, which she did not yet. But there was an intelligence in his dark eyes that was immediately apparent, a quality of seeing clearly that was rare enough to be notable, and when he looked at her directly, she felt again that strange thing she had felt the day before across the crowd, that sense of recognition that had no rational basis. "Miss Underwood," he said, and his voice was quieter than she had expected, carefully controlled. "My name is Frederick Turner. I need to speak with you about Harlan Moss, and I need you to trust me at least long enough to hear what I have to say." Irene set down her coffee cup with deliberate calm. "Mr. Turner," she said, "you were at the auction yesterday, and you did not bid. I spent most of last night trying to decide whether that means you have a conscience or a strategy." Something shifted in his expression then, something small and quickly controlled, but she caught it. "Both, I hope," he said. She studied him for a moment. In the bright morning light coming through the Buford kitchen window, she could see the precise quality of his attention, the way he was watching her, with the kind of focus that suggested he was simultaneously evaluating several things at once and finding her to be more than he had anticipated. She had been appraised by enough men in the last 24 hours to recognize the difference between that kind of assessment and something else entirely. "Then sit down," she said, "and tell me everything." He sat across from her at the Buford kitchen table, and Clement Buford, reading the room with more perceptiveness than Irene had credited him, took his wife to the barn to attend to some suddenly urgent farm business. And Frederick Turner laid it all out for her, clearly and without softening it, which she appreciated more than she could immediately express. He told her about the 18 months of evidence gathering. He told her about the clerk in the land office. He told her about the federal case and the correspondence with the marshal's office in Wichita. He told her about the other families Moss had destroyed, naming them, and she recognized 2 of the names as people her father had known. He told her about the original loan document he had not yet been able to obtain but believed was held in Moss's private safe, a safe that was in the office on Main Street, and that the original document, if they could retrieve it, would show the fraudulent alterations clearly because the clerk had told him exactly what had been changed and where the original ink had been scraped. He told her it would take approximately 6 more weeks to complete the legal case if nothing went wrong, and then he told her what he needed from her. "There are 2 things," he said, leaning forward slightly across the table, and she noticed that his hands, which were resting flat on the table's surface, were very still, the hands of a man who had learned to control even involuntary movement. "The first is that you know the Underwood homestead's physical layout better than anyone. There is something on that property that I believe Moss wants enough to have rushed this auction rather than waiting for the standard legal process, and I need to understand what it is." Irene thought about this. "My father filed an updated survey last year," she said slowly. "The original homestead claim was 160 acres, but he'd been quietly acquiring the parcels on the eastern edge for several years, small pieces that adjacent claimants had abandoned. He never registered the full accumulation because he worried about attracting attention." Turner's expression sharpened. "How much total acreage?" "Something closer to 400 acres." and the eastern parcels run directly to the proposed railroad siding. I found the survey notes in his desk after he died. Moss wouldn't have known about those eastern parcels unless— She stopped. Unless he found the survey notes, Turner finished, which he would have if he had access to the homestead property before your father's death. The word hung between them like smoke. Before your father's death. They both understood what that implied about the timeline of Joseph Underwood's fall from a horse. Irene looked at her hands. She had known, in the way that grief sometimes knows things before the mind is ready to state them plainly, that her father's death had not been an accident. Hearing someone else articulate the logical structure of it was both devastating and clarifying. "What is the second thing you need?" she said, and her voice was steady, which she was proud of. "I need you to stay in Caldwell," he said. "I know that is a great deal to ask. The indenture contract is fraudulent, and I will have it voided, but it will take time, and if you run before I complete the legal case, Moss will simply pursue you through legal channels, and it will complicate the federal case. If you remain here, under the contract's terms but not as Moss's property, because Buford holds the contract, not Moss, you are in a position to help me gather the final pieces of evidence I need." Irene looked at him for a long time. The light through the kitchen window was warm and golden on the wooden floor, and outside she could hear the ordinary sounds of a farm morning, chickens and a distant dog and the creak of the well rope. Normal sounds. Sounds completely incongruous with the conversation she was having. "You are asking me to voluntarily remain in a situation designed to humiliate and constrain me," she said carefully, "in order to help you destroy the man who murdered my father." "Yes," Turner said. He did not soften it. He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who had thought carefully about whether he had the right to ask this, and had decided that the truth demanded it. She nodded once, a small, decisive movement. "Then we have an arrangement, Mr. Turner." The look he gave her then was brief and quickly masked, but she saw something in it that she did not know what to do with, something that went beyond professional respect and into territory that neither of them was ready to name. He looked away and stood up from the table, reaching for his hat. "I should tell you," he said, setting the hat on his head, looking at the door rather than at her, "that I am sorry I could not prevent the auction. I am sorry for what happened to you yesterday. I want you to know that I did not watch and do nothing because your situation was unimportant to me." There was something under those careful words that she heard clearly, something that had nothing to do with the legal case or Harlan Moss or any of the practical matters they had just discussed. She heard it and filed it away in a place she could examine later when the situation was less immediately dangerous. "I know," she said simply. He left, and Irene sat for a while longer at the Buford kitchen table, drinking the last of her coffee, and thought about the particular quality of the morning light and the particular quality of a man who would refuse to bid not because he did not want to, but because he had chosen a harder, more careful kind of protection. She thought about her father, and she let herself feel the grief for a moment, sharp and clean, and then she set it aside in the necessary way of people who have work to do. She was not done yet, not even close. Over the next several weeks, Irene established herself as a capable and discreet presence in the Buford household, which was not difficult because she genuinely liked both Clement and Margaret Buford, who were decent people caught in something they had not fully understood. Margaret, a small, energetic woman with a broad Kansas practicality, had been uncomfortable about the auction from the moment her husband had come home with the contract. And when Irene told her, carefully and without drama, some portion of what was happening, Margaret's discomfort hardened into a quiet, determined support that proved enormously valuable. Turner came to the Buford farm regularly, always with a visible excuse: farrier work, or delivering supplies from town, things that would not draw comment. He and Irene had developed a system of communication that involved leaving notes in a specific location in the Buford hay barn, a loose board in the third stall from the left, and it was through these notes that the investigation advanced in parallel streams. Each note he left her was precise and factual, laying out what he had learned and what he still needed. She responded in kind. She told him everything she knew about the Underwood property, every survey marker and every hidden feature, including the creek ford on the southern boundary that she suspected might be significant to the railroad's planning. She told him about the men who had worked for her father, a hired hand named Samuel Briggs who had left abruptly 2 weeks before her father's death, and whose departure had always troubled her. Turner tracked down Briggs in a town 40 miles east and learned that Briggs had seen something at the Underwood homestead the night of Joseph's death, something that had frightened him badly enough to leave and keep quiet, and that with careful and patient conversation, and the assurance that Moss would be brought down by federal authority rather than local law that Moss controlled, Briggs was willing to make a statement. That statement, combined with the land office clerk's testimony, created a criminal case to set alongside the civil fraud case. That was the hidden motive Turner had been building toward, not just the voiding of fraudulent documents, but the criminal prosecution of Harlan Moss for fraud, conspiracy, and now the murder of Joseph Underwood. It was a legal structure that would be inescapable if they could complete it, but Moss was not oblivious. By mid-September, Turner began to notice signs that Moss was aware something was moving against him, though he apparently had not yet identified Turner specifically. Moss had hired 2 additional men, hard-looking individuals who had appeared in Caldwell without any visible employment purpose, who spent their time in the saloon and seemed primarily occupied with watching who was talking to whom. One of the men Irene recognized from the auction, a broad-shouldered individual with a flat expression who had been standing near Moss on the platform. This was the first truly dangerous complication. The second came on a Thursday morning in late September when Irene was in the Buford kitchen making bread and Margaret Buford came in from town with a pale face and shaking hands, and the news that Dexter Cray, the auctioneer, had been found dead in the alley behind the saloon. The official account was a robbery. Turner's note in the hay barn the following day was terse and alarmed. Cray had apparently been approached by someone from the marshal's office in Wichita. Turner had given them his name as a potential witness, and Moss had learned of it through his connection to the county sheriff. Cray knew enough about the fraudulent mechanics of the auction to be seriously damaging to Moss. Now he was dead. Irene stood in the hay barn reading Turner's note in the cool September morning light that came in golden through the gaps between the boards, and she felt the specific fear of someone who understands that the danger has escalated from abstract to immediate. Turner's note said she needed to be careful, that she should not go into Caldwell alone, and that he was accelerating the timeline. She wrote back, "I am not frightened enough to be reckless. Tell me what you need." He did not come to the farm for 4 days after that, and the absence was a specific kind of torment that she had not anticipated. She had not expected to care about his safety in the way that she did, had not anticipated that the practical professional arrangement between them would have developed the quality it had developed, the quality of something she could not name yet, but which was present in every exchange of carefully worded notes, every brief meeting in the hay barn where they spoke quickly about evidence and timelines and legal strategy, but where there was always something else operating underneath the professional surface. A current that neither of them had yet chosen to acknowledge aloud. She found herself reading his notes more carefully than was strictly necessary, noticing the way his language shifted between the formal precision of legal analysis and something slightly more personal when he wrote about her situation, a quality of genuine concern that the formal register could not entirely contain. She noticed the small thing he had said on that first morning, sitting at the Buford kitchen table, that he had not watched and done nothing because her situation was unimportant to him. She turned that sentence over in her mind at night more than was strictly productive. When he came to the farm again on the 4th day, Arriving at the barn just after dawn while the dew was still on the grass, she was already there, mucking out the stalls because she could not sleep and needed something to do with her hands. He pushed the barn door open and stopped when he saw her, and there was a moment before he composed his expression back into the focused, professional quality she had come to expect, in which she saw something unguarded, something that looked very much like relief. "You are all right," he said. "I am all right," she confirmed. "I did not hear from you for 4 days, Mr. Turner." "I was in Wichita," he said, moving into the barn, pulling the door shut behind him. "I met with Deputy Marshal Crawford in person. He has agreed to issue federal warrants for Moss's arrest on the fraud charges, which are complete enough to proceed. The murder of Cray has actually strengthened the case because it demonstrates a pattern of obstruction. They want to move within 3 weeks. Irene set down the pitchfork she had been holding and looked at him. The morning light was coming through the gaps again, making long gold lines across the barn floor, and he was standing in one of them. And she was aware in a way that was inconvenient and absolutely not the point of this conversation that he was very close to her, closer than their meetings usually permitted. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. But there is something I need to tell you. He paused, and she saw him choosing his words, and the fact that he was being careful told her it was something significant. In the course of the Wichita meeting, Crawford told me that he has information suggesting Moss intends to move the contents of his safe before the end of October. He has apparently become sufficiently alarmed by something to begin liquidating. The original loan documents, she said immediately. Yes. If he moves or destroys them, the fraud case becomes significantly harder to prove, though not impossible. The criminal case against him for your father's death is more robust now, between Briggs's testimony and certain evidence I have from the land office. But the document theft and fraud matter, which is the foundation of returning your property to you, depends on those originals. Irene looked at him steadily. Then we need to get inside that safe. That is not something I can ask you to do, he said. You are not asking me, she said. I am telling you. That property was my father's. Those documents directly concern my family and my land. I have as much right to pursue this as you do, and probably more. A muscle in his jaw moved. He looked at her with an expression that combined multiple things simultaneously, and she recognized that he was doing the internal calculation of a man who understood that she was right and was trying to find an argument against it that was stronger than her logic, and that he could not. It would be dangerous, he said. I am aware of that. Moss has those 2 men watching the office. Getting inside when neither they nor Moss are present would require very specific timing. Then we need to establish the timing, she said. Tell me what you know about Moss's schedule. He told her, and she listened, and they built the plan together at the back of the Buford barn in the September morning, with the horses shifting quietly in their stalls and the gold light moving across the floor as the sun climbed. It was the most naturally collaborative thing Irene had done since before her father's death, and it had the quality of something she recognized without being able to name it. The quality of 2 minds that operated in a similar register finding each other. They talked for 2 hours. When the plan was clear between them, there was a pause in the conversation, the natural pause that follows the completion of a practical task, and in that pause the thing that neither of them had yet named became briefly and undeniably present. Miss Underwood, Turner began. Irene, she said. She had not planned to say it. The correction came from somewhere below the level of conscious decision. He looked at her, and the controlled expression shifted again into something that she was beginning to understand was his actual face beneath the careful professional surface, a face that carried old pain and genuine warmth, and something that she was increasingly certain was the beginning of love, though she could not have said when it had started. Irene, he said, and his voice was different when he said it, quieter and less controlled. He stopped, started again. There is something that I should, Frederick, she said, and she used his given name deliberately, watching his face when she did. He was still for a moment. When this is finished. When it is over and Moss is in federal custody and my property is returned, and I am no longer in an illegal indenture contract, there will be time then to say whatever needs to be said." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was somewhere between relief and a kind of careful, contained longing that she felt answer in her own chest. "Yes," he said simply. "There will be time then." He left, and Irene stood alone in the barn for a moment in the gold morning light with one hand pressed flat against the wooden wall, taking a measured breath, and then she went back inside to help Margaret with breakfast and to think very carefully about timing and locks and the layout of Harlan Moss's Main Street office. The plan they had constructed was precise. Moss had a standing weekly engagement every Wednesday evening at the home of the county judge, an engagement that began at 7 and typically ran past 10 o'clock, given the judge's enthusiastic approach to Moss's whiskey supply. The two hired men were almost always in the saloon on Wednesday evenings. The office would be empty. Irene had noted, on her 2 prior visits to Caldwell before the auction, that the back alley entrance to Moss's office building was used for deliveries and had a simpler lock than the front door. She had not known at the time that she was noting this, but she had the kind of observational habit that her father had instilled in her, the habit of seeing and filing away the physical details of places. Turner had obtained the specific information about the safe from the land office clerk, who had seen it on one occasion when Moss had opened it carelessly. It was a cast iron box safe bolted to the floor in the back corner of the office, and the combination had not been changed since the clerk had seen Moss open it, because Moss was the kind of man who became complacent about the things he believed were invisible. The combination itself, Turner had spent a careful week working that out, with the clerk's partial memory and a knowledge of the pattern Moss used for other locks, which the clerk had also observed. It was 4 numbers, and Turner had a reasonable confidence in them. On the Wednesday evening in early October that they had chosen, Irene left the Buford farm at 6 o'clock in the company of Margaret Buford, who had agreed, in the straightforward way that practical women sometimes agree to enormously consequential things, to drive her into Caldwell on the pretext of purchasing dress goods at the general store. Turner would be in the alley behind Moss's office by 6:30. Margaret would park the wagon and go to the general store and wait, and if she did not see Irene within 45 minutes, she would drive to find Turner's contact at the marshal's office whose name Turner had given her. Irene changed out of the practical day dress she had worn from the farm into a darker, less visible set of clothes in the back of the wagon while Margaret drove, the deep October dark coming down quickly over the flat Kansas landscape, and she thought about her father and about Frederick Turner, and about the particular courage that consists not of the absence of fear, but of doing the necessary thing in spite of it. The Caldwell Main Street was lit and populated when they arrived, the saloon noisy, the general store still open. Margaret drove the wagon to the store front, and Irene slipped off the back and into the side street without drawing any attention. She moved through the dark toward the alley behind Moss's office with a deliberate, unhurried pace, because hurrying attracts notice. Turner was already there. He materialized from the shadow beside the back door as she reached it, and for a fraction of a second when she saw his shape in the dark, she felt something that was not strictly fear, a sensation that was related to but distinct from relief, a sensation that had his name on it in a way she was no longer trying to ignore. "The men are in the saloon," he murmured, low and even. "Moss left for the judge's house 20 minutes ago. We have time." He worked the back door lock with a tool she could not see clearly in the dark, and it took him perhaps 3 minutes, and then the door was open, and the darkness inside smelled of paper and leather, and the particular dusty closed smell of a room that someone inhabits but does not live in. They moved through the back room to the main office without lighting a lamp until they were certain the front windows would not be visible from the street, and then Turner lit a small lantern turned very low, and they found the safe in the back corner exactly where the clerk had described it. Turner crouched before it. Irene stood close, holding the lantern, watching the street side of the office from the corner of her eye. She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the concentration in his face, of the steadiness of his hands as he worked the combination. The safe was silent, and the office was silent, and outside the distant noise of the saloon continued like the sound of a world that did not know what was happening in this room. The first combination attempt failed. He sat back slightly, adjusted his thinking, tried the second variation. The safe opened. Inside, organized with the particular precision of a man who was systematically criminal, were folders of documents. Turner moved through them quickly and efficiently, reading just enough of each to identify it. Land claim files, loan documents, correspondence with the county judge. And there in the third folder, the original Underwood loan agreement, and beside it, a second document that neither of them had anticipated. Turner held this second document closer to the lantern and read it, and Irene watched his face change. "What is it?" she said. He looked up at her. "It is a contract between Moss and a representative of the Kansas Pacific Railroad, dated 14 months ago. It grants Moss a commission for securing the land parcels needed for the eastern siding, including the Underwood property." He paused. "The full 400 acres your father had accumulated." The meaning of this settled over Irene like cold water. The railroad had known, or at least Moss had contracted with a representative of the railroad who had not asked questions. Her father had been killed not just for his visible homestead, but for the additional parcels he had quietly accumulated, parcels that made his full property essential to the railroad's plans. And Moss had known the full extent of the property and had contracted to deliver it. The betrayal was so much larger than she had understood. Turner took both documents and replaced everything else precisely as he had found it, closed the safe, and led her back out through the alley. His hand found her elbow in the dark as they moved, a steadying gesture, and she let it remain. In the alley outside, the cold October air on her face, she stood for a moment, breathing slowly, working through the implications. "The railroad contract," she said, "changes everything," he said quietly. "The federal case is now not just about Moss. It involves the railroad's conduct, which makes it significantly more complex but also significantly more powerful." He paused. "Are you all right?" It was a simple question, and she considered giving a simple answer, and then she said honestly, "Not entirely. I knew he had killed my father for the land. I did not understand fully how carefully planned it all was, how far in advance." Turner was quiet for a moment, and in the dark she could not read his expression, but she could hear in his silence the particular quality of a man who is controlling something he wants to say. "Joseph Underwood's death will be answered for," he said at last, and the word "answered" was the most direct he had ever been with her about that element of the case, and the directness of it was a form of acknowledgment that mattered to her more than she could explain. They collected Margaret from the general store and drove back to the Buford farm in the dark, and in the back of the wagon Irene sat with the copies of the documents Turner had made, quick written transcriptions he had prepared in the dim lantern light. The originals left in Moss's safe to avoid alerting him before the warrants were served, and felt the particular dense exhaustion that follows sustained fear. Margaret drove without speaking, which was exactly right. Turner rode alongside on his horse, not pressing close but present at the edge of the wagon's lamplight, a solid shape in the dark Kansas night, and Irene found her eyes returning to him without her permission. She thought about what she had said to him in the barn. When this is finished, there will be time to say whatever needs to be said. She thought about how true that was and how much she wanted it to be over. The following 2 weeks were taut with the particular suspense of a plan approaching its conclusion. Turner delivered everything to Deputy Marshal Crawford in Wichita, including the transcribed evidence of the railroad contract, and Crawford moved with satisfying speed once he understood the full scope of what was before him. Federal warrants were issued for Harlan Moss on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Joseph Underwood. A secondary inquiry was opened into the railroad representative named in the contract. The county judge, confronted with the evidence of his compromised rulings and the speed at which federal authority was descending, agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced charge. On a cold Tuesday morning in the middle of October 1878, Deputy Marshal Crawford and two federal deputies rode into Caldwell and arrested Harlan Moss at his office on Main Street. His two hired men attempted to interfere and were subdued without serious injury. Moss went into custody shouting about his legal rights, which was noted by everyone present as one of the more pointed ironies of the day. Irene was at the Buford farm when it happened, and Turner came to tell her in person. She was in the kitchen garden when she saw him coming up the farm lane on his horse, and she knew from the way he was riding with something released about him, something that the controlled, careful bearing she had come to know had relaxed, that it was done. She met him at the gate, and he swung down from the horse and they looked at each other across the gate post in the cold October morning light. "It is done," he said. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment. She heard her father's name in her mind, and she let the grief and the relief exist together, which was complicated and necessary and true. When she opened her eyes, Turner was still looking at her with an expression that had nothing professional or controlled about it, that was simply open and present and waiting. "The indenture contract," she said, "voided this morning by federal order. You are free. The property claim against your father's estate is dismissed. The Underwood homestead with all associated parcels is yours. Crawford's office will prepare the documentation this week." She nodded slowly and then said nothing for a moment because the enormity of it was too large for immediate words. Her father's land, her father's work, all of it preserved. "Irene," Turner said, and his voice was different, stripped of the careful professional layer entirely, just his voice, just his own voice, quiet in the cold morning air. She opened the gate. It was a simple gesture, practical. She was standing on the inside of the garden gate, and she opened it so that he could come in, and it was also the most eloquent thing she had done in months, because he understood it the way she intended it, as an invitation that was about more than the gate, and he stepped through. They were very close then, close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes in the October light, dark brown with a quality of warmth that the controlled face had always partly hidden. He reached up and touched her face very carefully with one hand, a touch so tentative and careful that it said everything about what he had been holding back for weeks, and she put her hand over his. "I have been wanting to say something to you for quite some time," he said. "I have noticed," she said, and the faint smile that moved across her face was one she could not prevent. "When I stood at the edge of that crowd at the auction," he said, "and I looked at you and you looked back at me and I turned away, I need you to know that it was the hardest thing I have done. Not bidding, turning away, because I had to." "I know," she said. "I understood it later, not at the time, but later. What I have not yet been able to say is that the reason it was so hard was not only the practical circumstance. It was that from that first moment, something," he paused, searching for the word. "You were looking at me with your chin up and your hands bound, and the entire weight of an unjust situation bearing down on you, and you were utterly unbroken. And I thought, this woman is extraordinary, and I cannot bid on her because she is not something to be bid on, and the very idea that she is standing on that platform is a wrong that I will spend whatever is required to correct." Irene felt the tears come then, quietly, not from sadness but from the accumulated weight of all of it, her father, the auction, the weeks of fear and determination and carefully contained feeling, and the particular tenderness of what he had just said. "I am not a weeping woman generally," she said. "I know you are not," he said gently. "I have had ample evidence of that." She laughed a little, and he smiled, and the smile transformed his face in a way she had not yet seen but would see many more times, open and warm and entirely without the careful guardedness. He kissed her there in the kitchen garden of the Buford farm on a cold October morning, and it was gentle and certain and exactly right, and she kissed him back, and whatever was between them had no longer any need of being unnamed. The weeks that followed the arrest of Harlan Moss were, in many ways, the most quietly momentous of Irene's life. The formal legal proceedings moved forward with the methodical machinery of the federal system, depositions and hearings, and the gradual assembly of the full evidentiary record. Samuel Briggs gave his testimony about the night of Joseph Underwood's death with a quiet and specific guilt that was not entirely without sympathy, because he had been a frightened man with a family, and Irene found she could hold his cowardice and her anger at it alongside an understanding of what fear does to people. Turner was present at every legal proceeding, as the primary investigator whose work had built the case, and beside him at the hearings, Irene sat with the same straight spine she had maintained on the auction platform, but with a completely different foundation beneath it. Moss's lawyers attempted the predictable array of challenges and delays, arguing that the federal jurisdiction was improperly invoked and that the evidence was contaminated. None of it held. Crawford was thorough and experienced, and the case Turner had built over 18 months was not a thing that could be dismantled by arguments about procedural technicality. By December, Harlan Moss had been bound over for federal trial on all charges. The county judge had been stripped of his position and was cooperating with the prosecution, and the two hired men had agreed to testimony in exchange for reduced charges. The railroad representative who had signed the contract with Moss was a man named Pringle, and his case became a separate federal proceeding. The Kansas Pacific Railroad itself, faced with the evidence of the contract, made the practical calculation that settling the civil claim against the Underwood estate was preferable to the full exposure of a fraud trial, and a settlement was reached that compensated Irene for the loss of her father and the disruption to the property. A sum that was not enormous but that was just, and more importantly was an acknowledgement. The Underwood homestead was returned to her formally in November 1878, and she rode out to it on a cold, gray day with Turner beside her on his horse, and they stood on the rise above the main house in the wind and looked out over the prairie, all 400 acres of it, to the distant marker at the eastern boundary. He would have been proud, Turner said quietly. Irene looked at the land her father had built, and the land he had quietly accumulated piece by piece over years, and she felt him there in the geography of it, in every fence post and creek crossing, and the particular way the cottonwood grove in the northeast corner moved in the wind. He would have liked you, she said, and she meant it with the full weight of the compliment. Turner looked at her. Would he have approved of me generally or of me specifically as relates to his daughter? Both, she said, and something warm and certain moved through her. He was a good judge of character, slow to decide but certain once decided. Turner was quiet for a moment, looking out over the land. The wind came from the northwest with the smell of coming winter in it. "I have something I want to ask you," he said. She did not make it easy on him because she was herself and it was not her nature to make easy what should be weighty. She waited. He turned to face her, and the look on his face was the most completely unguarded she had seen it yet, all of the careful professional layering gone, just Frederick Turner in the cold November light, looking at her with every complicated feeling she had watched him contain for months now present and clear. "I would like," he said carefully, "to ask whether you would consider marrying me, not because of the legal situation, which is resolved, not because of the property or any practical necessity. Because over these months I have come to know you better than I have known anyone in a very long time, and what I know of you is the most remarkable thing I have encountered, and I believe I am entirely and irrevocably in love with you, and I would like to spend the rest of my life in a condition that I find very difficult to imagine ending." Irene looked at him for a moment in the winter wind, and she thought about the auction platform, and the way his eyes had found hers across the crowd, and then looked deliberately away. She thought about the notes in the hay barn and the morning in the kitchen garden and the months of working together in danger and in the particular intimacy of a shared difficult purpose. She thought about the way he said her name. "Frederick," she said, "I made up my mind about you somewhere around the third note in the hay barn." He blinked. "That was in September." "It was," she agreed pleasantly. "You could have told me." "You had work to do," she said. "We both did, but I will tell you now, yes." With considerable enthusiasm. The smile that broke across his face was the one she loved best, the open, warm, unguarded one, and he reached for her hand and she gave it to him. And they stood on the rise above the Underwood homestead with the winter coming and 400 acres of Kansas land stretching away in all directions, and it was exactly enough. They were married in January of 1879, a quiet ceremony at the small Methodist church in Caldwell, with Clement and Margaret Buford as witnesses, and a preacher named Hoskins who was a kind man with cold hands and a tendency to cry at weddings. There was a small gathering afterward at the Buford farm, modest and warm, the way things are when people who have been through genuine difficulty choose to celebrate with care rather than extravagance. Turner had spent the previous 2 months making structural repairs to the main house on the Underwood homestead, work he had done himself with the methodical competence she had come to associate with everything he did, not because it needed to be done before the wedding, but because he had told her that he wanted to put his own work into the place before he called it home, which she had understood completely. She had spent those same weeks doing the more internal work of deciding what she wanted the homestead to become, now that she was not simply preserving her father's vision but building her own, the farm work she knew and loved. But the eastern parcels, the ones that had caused so much tragedy, were genuinely valuable railroad-adjacent land, and she had thoughts about their best use that went beyond simple farming, thoughts about a small commercial operation that she began sketching in the evenings in a notebook Turner had given her. When she showed him the notebook, he read through it twice, asked 3 specific questions about projected costs, and said, "This is a good plan. I can help with the legal structures for the commercial licensing." "You were reading it as a lawyer," she observed. "I was reading it as someone who is very impressed," he said, "and who wants to make sure the legal underpinning is solid, both things at once." She kissed him for that, which he received without complaint. Their first year on the rebuilt Underwood homestead was one of considerable work and considerable joy, the two things existing together in the way they do for people who have found their right life. Turner continued some legal work, particularly cases involving land fraud and the rights of homesteaders against predatory commercial interests, work that had found him a reputation in the county that brought clients from considerable distances. He worked cases out of a small office in Caldwell 3 days a week and was home the other 4, and the arrangement suited both of them in ways that had to do with the specific personalities involved, both of them people who valued both work and presence and solitude in measured doses. Irene ran the farm with a combination of her father's careful methodology and her own restless innovation. She planted the eastern parcels with a rotation system she had read about in a journal Turner had found in Wichita on one of his marshal's office visits, a system developed by agricultural experimenters in the Midwest that she adapted to the specific Kansas conditions. She established the small commercial operation she had planned, a grain storage and transport arrangement that took advantage of the proximity to the railroad siding, and that, in its 2nd year, was producing an income that made her very quietly proud. Harlan Moss was convicted in federal court in the spring of 1879 on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Joseph Underwood. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The sentence was read out in the Wichita Federal Courthouse, and Irene sat in the gallery and heard it with Turner's hand in hers and felt something settle, finally, completely. It was not joy, not exactly. It was the particular peace that comes when justice, which is not always reliable in this world, actually arrives. On the drive back from Wichita, through the spring Kansas landscape with the grass turning green and the sky enormous and pale blue above the flatland, Turner drove and Irene sat beside him on the wagon seat, and they talked for a long time about ordinary things, about the farm and the cases he was working, and the vegetable garden she was planning, and the book she was reading. And under the ordinary things was a current of happiness so steady and warm that she thought it might be the best thing she had ever felt. "I want to tell you something," she said after a comfortable silence. He glanced at her. "That sounds like the beginning of news." She smiled. "We are going to have a baby." The wagon stopped. He had not consciously pulled the reins, but the horse had felt the subtle signal and halted on the road with the patient resignation of a horse accustomed to human emotion. Turner looked at her, and the expression on his face was the most completely open she had ever seen it, something beyond the warm, unguarded smile she loved, something that went to a depth she had not yet seen. "Irene," he said. "Approximately November," she said. "So we have time to finish the east pasture fence." He laughed, sudden and genuine, and pulled her close on the wagon seat, and she leaned into him in the warm April afternoon, and felt the baby and the land and the resolution of everything they had come through as a single complete thing. A life that had been built from the most unpromising materials and had become exactly what it was supposed to be. Their son was born in November of 1879, on a cold and windy day when the first snow of the season was brushing the prairie outside the homestead windows. The birth was attended by Margaret Buford, who had a considerable practical knowledge of the matter, and a doctor who arrived from Caldwell in time to be helpful but not in time to have been necessary, which Margaret considered the proper ordering of things. The baby was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined expression, which Turner observed with a quality of wonder that he made no attempt whatsoever to conceal. They named him Joseph Frederick Turner, Joseph for the grandfather whose land they stood on and whose memory had shaped everything, Frederick for the father who had refused to bid, because he had known something more important than wanting. In the years that followed, the Underwood homestead became Turner land in name as well as fact, though Irene kept the Underwood name on the property deed alongside Turner's, a decision she had made thoughtfully and that Frederick had supported without reservation, understanding exactly what it meant and exactly why it mattered. Her father's claim, built over 16 years, was not something to be replaced. It was something to be continued. Turner's legal practice grew into something significant. By 1882, he had become the attorney of reference in the county for homestead and land rights cases, with a particular reputation for taking cases that others would not, cases involving the kinds of predatory practices that Harlan Moss had employed, cases where the client was a farmer or a family without resources, and the opposition was a commercial interest with lawyers and connections. He won more than he lost. He did not win them all, and the ones he lost sat with him in the way that losses sit with people who take their work seriously. But the work itself was the kind that matched his particular combination of skills and conscience. In the spring of 1882, Irene discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she told Turner at the breakfast table on an ordinary Tuesday morning over coffee, watching his face do the same thing it had done on the wagon road 3 years before, that movement to unguarded joy that was one of the most reliable pleasures of her days. "Another November baby?" he asked. "October this time," she said. "The farm will be in better shape." Their second child was a daughter, born in October of 1882, whom they named Clara Jane Turner, Clara for Irene's mother who had died when she was 11, and whose memory Irene had carried the way you carry the memory of things that shaped you before you had the words to understand them. Jane was Turner's mother's name, a woman he had spoken of with a warm respect that told Irene everything important about how he had learned to treat women. Clara was a round and cheerful baby who grew into a round and cheerful child with her mother's observational intelligence and her father's steadiness, a combination that would serve her well in a world that was complicated. The cottonwood grove on the northeast corner of the property became a place where Frederick Turner went in the evenings when a case was troubling him, walking the length of it in the long prairie dusk, working through the legal argument the way he worked through everything, systematically and without rushing. Irene had learned this about him early and had never tried to change it, because it was not a withdrawal from her but a processing that returned him to her clear and ready, and she respected the integrity of that. She had her own version of the same thing, which was the kitchen garden at dawn, where she worked in the early morning quiet before the children woke and sorted out whatever needed sorting. They did not have the kind of marriage that erased difficulty. They were two people of strong character and clear opinions, and they disagreed sometimes with the full force of who they were, about money and about cases he took and about the direction of the farm, and once, memorably, about a particular fence line that became a 3-day argument before they both saw the humor in it and arrived at a solution that was better than either of their original positions. But the disagreements had a foundation beneath them, the same foundation that had been there from the beginning, the understanding that had passed between them across the distance of the auction crowd in August 1878, the recognition that had survived the months of danger and circumstance and had grown into something that neither of them would ever have exchanged for an easier story. The auction itself, in the way of things that mark you, had never entirely left them. Not as a wound, too much had been built since then for it to remain only a wound, but as a reference point, a before and after, a line that the story of their lives crossed at a moment when everything was at its worst and became instead the beginning of its best. Irene had once, in the second year of their marriage, tried to articulate why his refusal to bid had ultimately been the thing that had saved her, not just practically but in the larger sense, and she had said, "It was the only moment in that whole terrible day when someone treated me as though I was not something to be owned." And he had looked at her with that warm, clear look and said, "You were never something to be owned." The difficulty was convincing the situation of that, which took a little time. By 1883, the Underwood Turner homestead, as the county land records had it, was one of the more substantial working properties in the region, 400 acres well managed and productively used. The commercial grain operation expanded to a modest but reliable scale. A small herd of cattle that Joseph Turner, at 4 years old, was already demonstrating a serious interest in learning about. Turner's legal practice had moved from a small Caldwell office to a proper one with a clerk named Harris who was young and ambitious, and reminded Turner pleasantly of himself 15 years before, without the specific grief that had shaped those years. The federal case against the railroad representative Pringle had wound its way through the legal system and reached a conclusion in 1881 that was imperfect in the way of institutional justice, meaning that Pringle had received consequences proportionate to his actual criminal exposure, but that the larger institutional structures that had made his conduct possible remained intact and would require ongoing resistance. Turner had given an honest assessment of this outcome to Irene, who had received it with the same honest clarity with which she received most things, saying, "It is not everything, but it is something, and something built correctly is what we have." There was a day in the early spring of 1884, the kind of Kansas day that arrives unexpectedly in March with a warmth that belongs to May and makes everything feel possible in the unreasonable, generous way of early spring, when Irene stood on the rise above the homestead house and looked out over the land with Joseph beside her, his small hand in hers, pointing at the cottonwood grove and asking her about the birds that had arrived there in the last week, the first migrating birds of the season. Turner came up behind them and put his hand on her shoulder, and Joseph said, "There are birds, Papa," with the pure informative delight of a 4-year-old who considers all observations equally valuable. Turner crouched beside his son and looked at the cottonwood grove with the same gravity he brought to legal documents, which was one of the things Irene loved most about him as a father, and said, "So there are." "What kind?" Irene stood between her husband and the land her father had built, and the child who was both their futures. And the day was warm, and the grass was greening, and somewhere in the cottonwood grove, the birds were making the particular spring sound that had sounded over this land for as long as the land had been here. Before her father and before Harlan Moss, and before Frederick Turner riding into Caldwell with 18 months of evidence and the kind of fierce, careful love that does not announce itself, but simply acts. She thought about the auction platform and the rope around her wrists and the sound of the gavel and the moment when she had looked across the crowd and found his eyes. She thought about the hay barn and the notes with his careful handwriting and the gold morning light, and the conversation that had built something brick by brick in the middle of everything terrible. She thought about the kitchen garden gate and the first kiss and the cold November morning when Joseph had been born, and the way Frederick had held his son for the first time with an expression that she kept in her heart the way you keep certain things, carefully and permanently. She thought about what it meant to build a life not on the absence of darkness, but on the refusal to be defined by it, to take the worst thing that had happened and make it the foundation of the best thing, not through denial, but through the difficult and particular work of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what they were choosing. Joseph pulled at her hand and pointed again at the birds, insistent, because he had learned that the adult tendency to become still and quiet usually meant they were thinking about things that were not birds, and birds were considerably more interesting. She smiled and looked where he was pointing. Meadowlarks, Turner said beside her, having arrived at the identification. State bird. I know what meadowlarks are, Joseph said with 4-year-old dignity. I have seen them before. Many times, Turner agreed seriously. You are an expert. Irene laughed, and the sound of it went out over the prairie in the spring morning, over all 400 acres of land that had cost everything and been worth it. And the meadowlarks in the cottonwood grove sang back in their particular and irreplaceable way. And the sky was the enormous pale Kansas blue that goes on forever in every direction. And the story was not over, because the best stories never quite end. They simply deepen. They settle into the land and the people and become part of what the place is, become the kind of thing that children grow up inside without knowing the half of it yet, without knowing that the land under their feet was fought for and nearly lost and held by people who loved it and each other with the fierce, careful, unrelenting love that the frontier required and that the best people gave. That spring moved into summer, and the summer was a good one, dry enough for the grain and wet enough for the vegetable garden. And by July, Turner had won a case that established a significant precedent for homesteaders' rights in the county. A case involving a widow whose land had been targeted in a scheme, not entirely unlike the one Moss had used. And Irene had read the court summary with the particular satisfaction of someone who understands what had to happen for that victory to be possible. They had a dinner that evening to celebrate. Just the family, Irene and Turner and Joseph and Clara, who was nearly 2 years old by then, and had recently discovered both the word no and the concept of running, which she applied to everything with equal enthusiasm. The dinner was venison stew with cornbread and the first tomatoes from the kitchen garden, and Joseph ate with the dedicated focus of a child who takes food seriously, and Clara threw a considerable quantity of cornbread onto the floor, and Turner looked at Irene across the table in the lamplight with the expression she knew best, the warm and certain one, the one that said, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Later, after the children were asleep and the kitchen was quiet and the summer night was big and dark outside the windows with the stars brilliant over the flat land, they sat together on the porch in the way they had made a habit of, the end of the day when the work was done and the children were sleeping, and there was nothing required of either of them except presence. I have been thinking, Irene said, which was her standard opening for what Turner had learned were always significant observations. I know, he said, you have been thinking since Tuesday. She looked at him sideways. How do you know when I am thinking? You get very quiet in the kitchen garden at dawn, he said. Normally, you make a certain amount of noise. When you are working through something, you are entirely silent. She considered this. That is an invasion of privacy. That is 20 years of paying attention, he said, and then stopped, looking at the stars, and she understood that he had just registered the number. It has not been 20 years yet, she said. It will be, he said simply. And it would be. And it would be more than 20. And the meadowlarks would come back every spring to the cottonwood grove, and Joseph Turner would grow into a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's fierce intelligence, and who would one day stand on that same rise above the homestead house and feel the accumulated weight of the story he had been born into. The story that had begun with a gavel coming down in a crowded square in the August heat, and a pair of eyes meeting across the distance and refusing to look away. But all of that was ahead of them, and on this summer night on the porch, they were simply here, simply together, the way they had been working toward from the moment Frederick Turner had looked at Irene Underwood on that auction platform in Caldwell, Kansas, and made the choice that had saved her, and made the choice that had ultimately saved him as well, because there is a kind of person who can be found only by the right kind of trouble, and who has to come through the trouble to arrive at the life that was waiting on the other side of it. And those two people had been exactly that kind, and they had come through it. And the life that had been waiting was this one, on the prairie in the summer dark, permanent and chosen and entirely, completely theirs. The gavel had come down in the August heat, and the world had narrowed to a rope and a crowd and a man who turned away. And from that terrible beginning, they had built everything that mattered, and it stood. It stood in the land and in the children, and in the work they did, and in the way they looked at each other in the evenings on the porch with the stars over Kansas and the meadowlarks sleeping in the cottonwood grove. And it would go on standing, rooted in the earth her father had broken and tended, in the justice that Turner had built with the patience of a man who understood that some things take time, but that time spent in the right direction is never wasted. Irene Turner, formerly Underwood, daughter of Joseph, wife of Frederick, mother of Joseph, Frederick, and Clara Jane, leaned back in her chair on the porch of the homestead house on a summer night in 1884 and breathed the warm prairie air, and felt the particular, irreducible satisfaction of someone who has looked at the worst of what the world can offer and has answered it, not with bitterness, but with something that lasts. And beside her, Frederick Turner, who had once stood at the edge of a crowd and refused to bid on the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen, because he had known even then that she was not something to be bid on but someone to be chosen, and who had chosen her as carefully and as certainly as he had done anything in his life, put his hand over hers in the dark and held on.